Back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, August 6th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about Georgia Lieutenant Governor Geoff Duncan now switching political parties from being a Republican now to a Democrat in this state, with wide anticipation that he might run for governor in the 2026 midterm elections. Now, Geoff Duncan is a very well-known name in the Georgia Republican Party and now more so in the Georgia Democratic Party. In 2018, he was elected to become lieutenant governor of the state of Georgia by a wider margin than that of, at the time, Secretary of State, then Governor Brian Kemp, who ran in the same race in the 2018 midterm elections. But after Donald Trump got ever involved in American politics after January 6th and remained this constant presence in the GOP, Geoff Duncan had ultimately said that he was done being part of a political party that felt that they were necessarily needed to be the right-hand man of Donald Trump and supported him in all of the things that he had done since the 2020 election. And in 2022, he opted, rather than run for re-election, decided that because of Donald Trump's involvement in Republican politics, decided that he was not going to run for governor or lieutenant governor in 2022, and instead would allow Burt Jones or whoever else wanted to run for this position to run for it in the 22 midterm elections, to which they ended up winning that cycle by about 6 points across the race. But Geoff Duncan, coming from the lieutenant governor who served under the now incumbent Republican Governor Brian Kemp, switching political parties is a huge change, quite frankly, overnight in American politics time, looking at the time that he was serving under Brian Kemp, a big advocate for Donald Trump and his policies, to then after January 6th, pretty much cutting ties with the mainstream Republican Party, spoke at the DNC last August, and now is deciding to switch political parties. And as I mentioned early on, there has been wide speculation that he runs for governor in the 2026 race. When he initially was being considered, he told the press that he certainly would not run as a Republican for governor in the 2026 elections, but was open to the idea of running as an independent or as a Democrat. And so when he was asked that question, there was all this conversation because he said, I might run as a Democrat, but his party registration had maintained itself as Republican. But up until today, he announces this change in a pretty public display that seems to indicate that he's somewhat interested in running for governor as a Democrat in the 2026 cycle. Now, a lot of Democrats have mixed feelings about Geoff Duncan running. They feel like on the Democratic side that they might have strong candidates who have already declared or might consider running or might remove themselves from previously having dropped out of the race, people like Jason Carter and Lucy McBath, who might change their minds about whether or not they're running for governor. But there's also some Democrats on the other end who look at Geoff Duncan and say, if he can win the race, that's what we're looking for. And I'm not going to provide commentary on who I think would be, the best slated Democrat right now. I think there's a lot of Democrats who, based on the 2026 midterm elections national environment, could very well win the governorship. The focus of this video is on Geoff Duncan, and so I will speak to what I believe he might be able to provide, but also why there might be some hesitation around a nomination. For one part, it is very rare that a political party, even in a swing state, decides to go with a member of that party that joined in the last year, especially someone that had been a statewide elected official, lieutenant governor of the state, under a different political party. Now, Geoff Duncan coming into this certainly is making major headway for a big reason. If you are the former Republican lieutenant governor who has now made this decision to say, yeah, I want to run as a Democrat, people are going to pay attention to you whether or not they're going to vote for you. The things that he says and the things that he does over the next year leading up to a primary, because I do have, and I also believe much of this media speculation that this all is an effort to launch a gubernatorial bid in this state. I will be interested to see exactly how well he does across the state, given he's coming into this with a recent change in party affiliation. But in terms of general election candidacy and general election viability, the Democratic Party is not in a great position right now in terms of that regard. The last time we saw a governor election in Georgia, Brian Kemp defeated Stacey Abrams by roughly 8 points across the state. It was a pretty notable victory here for Brian Kemp, and one that really terrified Democrats going into 2026. And right now it's rated as a toss-up, battleground, lean Republican by Larry Sabato's crystal ball, and toss-up from race to the White House. Now, the counteracting Senate race with right now Senator Jon Ossoff, this race has the expectation of being a toss-up, but also more towards the Democratic Party. And all of the data indicates that Democrats right now have that slight upper hand in the Georgia Senate race in a way they might not in the Georgia governor's race. And like I said, 2022 was scarring for Democrats, not just because Brian Kemp was able to win in this state by 8 points, but also that on the same exact ballot in this state, we saw that Brian Kemp winning. Despite that, the Democrats won the Senate election in Georgia. Comparing margins, Brian Kemp won by 8 on the same ballot that Warnock won by about 1.5 points in the regular election, and then in the runoff by about 3. Keeping that in mind, that's an 11-point delta between Republican performance and Democratic performance amongst the same exact electorate. So thinking to 2026, Democrats are worried that Republicans might overperform in the governor election yet again, and right now, there are 2 declared candidates who have a very good chance at running in this race. Chris Carr, Georgia's Attorney General, and Burt Jones, the Lieutenant Governor of Georgia. Now, you might assume the lieutenant governor, and this honestly would be a matchup for the decades to see a lieutenant governor versus lieutenant governor under the same Republican governor running against each other. But again, lieutenant governor of Georgia, Georgia Attorney General. But Brian Kemp, when he was Secretary of State, defeated the incumbent lieutenant governor at the time, Casey Cagle, back in 2018. We covered that primary. It feels like a long time ago. It was a long time ago, nearly a decade ago. But the point is that could happen this time around. But that's separate. That's not the focus here. The focus is on Geoff Duncan, who, if he makes it to the general election, could stand to be in an okay position for the regular election. Now, does this mean he's the most electable Democrat? No. But does it mean he's the worst Democrat out there? No, too. I do think that there is a strong chance that if Geoff Duncan was to make it through a primary, that he could bring over some of those disaffected Republicans that liked Brian Kemp because he stood up to Trump in a way that Burt Jones, does the same talking points as Donald Trump, right? He does the same nationalized GOP rhetoric. Chris Carr, too, to the degree both of them do it in a way that Brian Kemp does not. And Brian Kemp's refusal to overturn the 2020 election and Brad Raffensperger's refusal to do the same are the reasons why they were the best performing Republicans across the entire state in the 2022 midterm elections. And a reason why Geoff Duncan provides a vulnerability for the Republicans insofar that he takes away votes that were Brian Kemp voters that wouldn't be opposed to a more centrist and moderate Democrat rather than what they might think comes out of the Democratic primary. Now, the flip side of that is that it is very hard to inspire a base to vote for a candidate that recently switched political parties. It has been very rarely done and only in states that are hyper-partisan. The last time I think this has succeeded really on the gubernatorial level, you have to go all the way back to 2017 when Jim Justice decided to switch political parties after winning in 2016 as a Democrat. Jim Justice ran across the state, won with 49.09% of the vote. In his state, Donald Trump won by 40 points. But he knew that as the partisanship went on, and Donald Trump met with Jim Justice didn't even endorse Hillary Clinton, but he was still a registered Democrat. Then in 2017 actually, switched political parties, but in 2020 won with a massive amount of support. Then in 2024, Patrick Morrisey, that same candidate that lost the Senate race to Joe Manchin in 2018, ran for governor and won easily. But the point is, it very rarely happens, and it takes states that are hyperpartisan, like Trump winning West Virginia by about 40 percentage points. And even then, Jim Justice knew that his time would come and switching political parties was more about political nature rather than it was about personal nature. Something that feels very different about Geoff Duncan switching political parties to the party that just lost Georgia in the last election. And I think his disaffection with the GOP is pretty clear. I think it speaks to the fact that there is a fracturing in the Georgia Republican base that even if Donald Trump, not if, he did, even though Donald Trump won the presidential election in Georgia in 2024, it paled in comparison, to where it was in 2016. Donald Trump won Georgia by a likely margin in 2016. Georgia and Ohio were only 3 points off of each other in 2024. Georgia, at the time also in 2016, voted to the right of Florida. Georgia was about 11 points to the left of Florida and 9 points to the left of Ohio. Looking at the shifts, Georgia didn't shift by that much in comparison to other swing states. While states like Pennsylvania shifted by 2.9 and Michigan by 4.2 and Wisconsin, that's the anomaly there. We talked about that a bit. Arizona by 5.8, Nevada by 5.5, Georgia swung by 2.4%. And it showed that the trend lines here, while moved in the right direction for Trump, moved on the overall stretch against the Republican Party. Because comparing it to 2016, Donald Trump did better in every single battleground state that Biden ended up winning in 2020 besides Georgia. Georgia, between 2016 to 2024, in fact, got bluer. Wisconsin got redder. Michigan got redder. Pennsylvania got redder. Arizona got redder. Nevada got redder. Georgia did not. And so 2026, Democrats are looking for a candidate who can win because the stakes aren't just the gubernatorial election. The stakes are also what might happen in the Senate race. If you have a race, for instance, where Brian Kemp or an equivalent is winning by 8 points for the Republicans across the state, it makes it difficult for Ossoff to avoid a runoff election. And Herschel Walker, while a weak candidate, is certainly weaker than some of the Republicans that are running in 2026. I don't think that Ossoff will be facing up in 2026 against a weaker Republican than Herschel Walker, but the national environment will be better. But you never want to be dragged down by a governor's race where how people are voting at one of the top tickets on the ballot here is more in line with the GOP than it is with the Democratic Party. You want a unified slate, and this would be the first time the Democrats would be able to win the governorship in the state of Georgia in a very long time. Now, thinking about the 2026 midterm elections, with someone like Geoff Duncan, I think you come into this as the favorite in the race. Now, Jason Esteves, I also think you come into this as the slight favorite in the race, but not everyone is going to provide that in Georgia. Not everyone is going to be able to do that, and for different reasons. I don't think that Geoff Duncan riles up and inspires the base, but Ossoff does, and if they get out and vote for him, they're going to vote for the Democrat in the governor's race. If Geoff Duncan can pull away and siphon off independent and Republican support, that's a benefit, even if it is marginal. In 2018, Georgia came that close in that election to being a race the Democrats could have been able to do super well in, right? They came within 1.5 points of winning the governorship in Georgia. That would have likely dictated how Georgia's maps were drawn in 2020, how the race continued into 2022. And Stacey Abrams losing this race obviously led to Biden winning the state in 2020. The focus was there, the infrastructure was there, but the point is that Abrams in 2018 showed Democrats that it was certainly possible. When the national environment's not so much in their way and Brian Kemp rises in favorability and likability, then sure, you face a tougher race. But this race in 2026 is one that Democrats need to win. If Jon Ossoff wants any chance of being president or vice president of the United States, Georgia needs to go to the Democratic Party. Otherwise, he leaves the Senate. Republicans appoint an interim appointee for 2 years. Under a Democratic midterm, Republicans probably win the seat. If he's up in 26, though, wins the seat, Democrats win the governorship, that race would barely be touched. Yes, they might have a regular election, but you give them the advantage of appointing potentially a strong incumbent. Looking at this Georgia race, the party switch here, I think, is the clearest indication yet that the former Republican lieutenant governor will be running for governor as a Democrat. And someone who left office as a Republican earlier yesterday, or today, really, major change, and left office 3 years ago as the Republican lieutenant governor, or 2 years ago, it was 2023, now running as a Democrat, will certainly shake up this race. Now, history has told us that this doesn't always do well for the political party that switches, and not to mention the candidate that switches. Senator Arlen Specter, if you remember him in 2010, switched political parties from being a Republican to a Democrat after Obama won his state by about 13 points. And I don't know if it was necessarily political nature. I think that he was just more inclined to move from Republican to Democrat, but either way, he did so with an existing Senate seat, gave Democrats a 60-seat majority in the U.S. Senate that ended up letting them pass Obamacare without a filibuster across the board here. And what that did for the Democrats was monumental, but it did not land them a victory. And Arlen Specter lost the primary as the incumbent Democratic senator because the base wasn't inspired to vote for him. So we'll watch We'll see. Back and forth. Geoff Duncan has certainly some electoral advantages of running for governor as a Democrat. But simultaneously, can he get through a primary? Will he win this primary? That is yet to be seen because he hasn't even announced that he's running. But I take this as an indication that this party switch is more than a party switch. It's a statement, and it's an opportunity to launch a candidacy in one of the states and one of the nation's closest races of the 2026 cycle. A lot of eyes on Georgia, now ones from both sides of the aisle, even members of political parties, switching sides to run for office here. It'll be interesting to see how it ends up in November of next year. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already. Check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2024-26 governor election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.